Let me quickly introduce to you our panelists. We have Professor Thuli Madonsela. She's an advocate of the High Court of South Africa, and she's the current Law Trust Chair in Social Justice and a law professor at the University of Stellenbosch, of course, our former public protector. She is involved currently in an incredibly important project, where she's the founder of the Tuma Foundation, Foundation, an independent democracy leadership and literacy public benefit organization and convener on social. She's Miss Wendy Knowles. She's a consumer journalist spanning over 30 years in the industry. Wendy has covered politics, fashion, and just about everything in trying to make it make sense and contribution of various media platforms. For the past 20 years, Wendy has specialized in consumer journalism, writing in Your Corner column for TSOP, Black Star Print, Daily Dispatch, and the Weekend Post as well. Our other fellow panelist is Dr. Harima Masondo. Dr. Masondo is a senior lecturer of economic history and development at Howard College here at UKZN. Dr. Masondo is a chief editor, founder and director of the Journal of the South African Democratic Teachers Union. She wrote an incredibly important book around SADTU, demythologizing the history of SADTU as well. She's written and co-authored around decolonization and other educational issues as well. Our other panelist as well is Professor Rosina Mart. Prof. Mart is an associate professor in the School of Social Sciences here at UKZN. At the age of 24, Mart was nominated for the Woman of the Year Award in South Africa for her work in the area of gender-based violence and for First Black Feminist Organization in South Africa as well. In 2009, Prof. Mart was appointed as an international research ambassador to the University of Bremen in Germany. And last but not least, we have Ms. Shannon Landers. Shannon is a PhD candidate in the Center for Communication, Media and Society here at UKZN. She specializes in the field of representation as well as identity, with a focus on the role of what she refers to as soft power in the various ways in which media creates and recreates the different images. So I hope you'd agree with me that we have a fantastically diverse panelists with us, spanning different kinds of political philosophy, critical theory, the corporate community, fashion, and all those other things as well, including corporate advertising and others. So it's incredibly a privilege of mine to facilitate this session. So without further ado, we will get started with our panel. The first one to kick us off will be Miss Wendy Knowles. Over to you, Wendy.
As a consumer journalist and someone that does some training with corporates as well, this is an issue which keeps happening, and it's incredibly annoying and sad and damaging. I've had many examples of it, some of them well publicized and others not as much. So I can think of a few other examples where the corporate normal has been a very small, narrow view of what normal is, completely out of kilter with South Africa, where we have more than 80%, or I think less than 10% white population, let's put it that way. So Appetizer did a social media campaign a few years ago, a black woman and a white woman together, and the caption was, "Every brunette needs a blonde friend." You ask white people what's wrong with that, and they're like, well, so what? And like, black people do not refer to their hair, refer to themselves as brunettes. It's a white term for dark hair. So that's another hair thing. And Appetizer fell on its sword and apologized very, properly over that. I think if that had happened now, 2020, that storm would still be raging because there's much heightened sensitivity and much more of a sense of we are not accepting this nonsense anymore. For years, for the best part of 20 years, every few years, I raised the issue of flesh-colored plasters in South Africa. In Africa, flesh-colored means my color, right? So you see black people walking around with these peach-colored plasters on their faces, on their skin, that's designed to blend in. And you say to the manufacturers, but this is Africa, why, how it's this countenanced, why, how could this happen? And the answers are I can't even remember them. They're so inappropriate or meaningless. Then they'll say, oh, but we have the see-through ones. Yes, but there's the pad in the middle that's flesh-colored, this color. If you really apply your mind to it, it's beyond ridiculous. But if you are a pale person working in those areas, you don't pick up that it's your normal, so why isn't it everybody else's normal? You don't see the problem, just like many men don't see sexism, overt or covert or whatever. They don't get it. So that's what we're sitting with. The other thing is, you'll see my daughter was a high-level gymnast, and when you get to a certain level of rhythmic gymnastics, you have these fancy leotards with flesh-colored, so that they blend in, so you just see the sparkles, and the sleeves you don't see, and the neck you don't see. It's supposed to have this dramatic, glamorous effect. Well, that's fine for the white gymnasts, but for the Indian colored and black gymnasts, the mothers were running around. The flesh colored was just one flesh, pale, and they were running around trying to diet with coffee and tea, and same goes for flesh colored toe caps for gymnastics. And I, as a gym mom, just could not actually believe that this was the situation here on the southern tip of Africa. So as I say, if you are pale, these normals seem, there's just no issue, you don't get it. And I think finally, every time one of these things happen, another great example, remember the H&M, the monkey, I think it was the cheeky monkey t-shirt. A lot of white people on social media and in social circles were saying, but I call my child a cheeky monkey. What's the problem with that? That's not offensive. Like, hello. It's just not getting it. We've lived in these silos. We've allowed to live in these, we were forced to, and then many of us remained in our silos up until this point, a generation beyond liberation, and we're still sitting with the legacy of white being normal. I think all corporates should be forced to watch the now 50-year-old video of Muhammad Ali being interviewed by Michael Parkinson on BBC. I watched it again last night, and it's wise. But Mama, he's telling how he used to say to his mom as a young boy, but Mama, why is everything white? Santa Claus and Jesus and the angels, and on he went. And so all the nice things were white, and we have blackmail. White people do bad things too, and I just think it's funny. People were laughing, but it's unfortunately as relevant 50 years later, especially in this country, as it was then. So for me, there just needs to be somehow, if I could wave a wand and get people to understand and relook at their concept of normal, and most particularly corporate people who make these decisions. None of them intentionally wanted to bring these media storms and protests and all the rest on their company. It's damaging financially and reputationally and all the rest, and they don't want to alienate the majority of their customers, but they're doing it because of an inexcusable lack of understanding, an inexcusable inability to step out of their little bubble and look at what normal and what cultural identities are beyond their own and beyond their peers who sit around them at the table.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for that. Prof. Matonsela?
Thank you, dear colleagues, and thank you, Wendy, for that wonderful introduction to the subject. The greatest challenge we have in corporate South Africa and in the corporate world is that we haven't reimagined the world. We were all raised in environments where difference is dichotomized. Black and white is seen in terms of better or worse. Women, men is seen in terms of better or worse. National and foreigner, young, old, etc. Things are seen from that lens of better or worse. Place that in our history in South Africa and generally in the whole world. To justify slavery, to justify sexism, or exclusion of women from opportunity, to justify withdrawal of opportunities from Black people, mining, job reservation, etc., there has to be a story that was given. I like the story about the child asking, why is everything white? But in South Africa, it was, why are Black people not having proper houses? Why don't they have cars? Why don't they have proper jobs? There had to be explanations. And the narrative started of the condemnation of Blackness. If you read the book Verwoerd, written by Dr. Verwoerd, who's the grandson of Dr. Verwoerd, he would tell you the culture within which he was brought in and the narrative that he was fed about the other. And I like a picture that he has in that book where everyone is passing and a Black man is passing, and next to the place where he's passing, there's a poster that says, beware of Black people. I have a story about my son having been in grade 2, if I'm not mistaken, grade 4. And his history book was still talking about a time when the people were moving from the Cape into the inland, and they were faced with many dangers. And these dangers were snakes, wild animals, and natives. And I remember asking the principal, where does my son, how should my son see himself in this context? I was concerned about my son, but little did about what about these other kids? How are they supposed to see my son? And that takes me to where we are now, where we're all complaining about who moved our cheese. Democracy was supposed to make things better. And why is it that corporate South Africa is still predominantly white? When I walked to address a very good company with a good image, with a loving message to Black people, I was quite shocked that I was one of 2 or 3 more Black people in the room and at executive level. But at retail level, this company sells to Black people, and shop floor level, it has Black people selling. But the question you have to ask yourself is this racism? Yes. But where I differ with many people, which was the subject of the storm, is what kind of racism is it? I put racism on a spectrum, and I've been working in this area for the greater part of my life, for more than 30 years, is that there's racism, the kind of racism that you're going to get from an organization that produces a person like Eugene Terblanche, where a person says, I hate Black people. A person, when they see Black people, they're going to shoot a Black person and then lie to a court and say that they thought it was an animal. But there's the kind of person who, Black or white, has internalized racism. They think good is white, Black is bad. They think male is good or strong, female is weak. So, but these are not verbalized assumptions. We call them unarticulated premises. You only see them when people act. I'll give you an example of a situation where I was sitting next to a Black man, and at some stage he had this lovely story about how he's helping young girls in his province to gain leadership skills, to see themselves in a good light, and to have big dreams, girls. And I said to him, here's that man, you should work with that man. And I was pointing at a colleague who was sitting away from us. This was the day we were celebrating Mandela's release early this year. This man, I'm going to call him Sipho. We sit there, we talk, we click on many things. And later, another colleague by the name of Jared is now standing to him. He hangs on to Jared, and he says, Sipho says to me, is this your boss? I look at him, I look at Jared, I look at this guy, it's Sipho, and I don't understand, why is Jared now my boss? He said, oh, when you pointed at him over there, I thought he was your boss. So I look at Jared and I laugh. We both laugh. He's so super embarrassed. But anyway, to cut the long story short, I said to Sipho, yes, he's my boss. And Jared says, I'm going to get you for this one. But anyway, we laughed about it. And somebody was sitting next to me, Mandy, asked why I did it. I wanted to do it to teach Sipho that he has unconscious bias. He assumes that leadership is for men. I never said, firstly, that the man I was pointing at is a man, is my boss. But secondly, I also never said that he was white. He just assumed that because I pointed in that direction, the leader had to be Jared, who happened to be white. The person I was pointing at was the leader of Imbumba Foundation, Richard Mabas. So just to cut the long story short, I want to say there's racism, but it operates on a spectrum. There's sexism, it operates on the spectrum, ageism, xenophobia, etc. And it doesn't mean, though, when you call it unconscious bias, you're saying it isn't bad, it shouldn't be dealt with. It just means from a strategic point of view, you can tackle it differently. And that takes me to cliques. I agree with everything that has been said by Wendy. But with cliques, I agree with her that people like cliques are not intending to be racist. It doesn't mean they're not racist from an unconscious bias point of view. But I do think that we have to examine that advert and look at the bias there, and the racism comes from not from indifference to difference, indifference to difference. Because normally when you go to a salon as a Black person, you talk about your hair being brittle, breaking, and damaged. White people talk about their hair as flat and, what do they call it? Flat and fine. That's their way of damage. But if you bring this together, and it seems to us, it gives the impression that you move from this one damaged one to that other one, that's where your narrative becomes racist. So the answer lies in two things. One, don't be indifferent to difference. But secondly, corporate South Africa should examine the fear of Blackness that it has, the condemnation of Blackness, because with all of their good intentions, there are neural pathways coming from the stories they were told as kids do not allow them to immediately associate merit with Blackness. And I can tell you stories of good people who would say things about women, about Blacks, about foreigners, but they don't intend to be bigoted, but they are bigoted. So I'm just going to leave it there if people want to ask me questions. But the question for me is, yes, we have an extreme problem of racism globally. But for me, the most toxic part of that racism is unconscious bias, because that's the most difficult part to fight, because you can't easily call it, because it doesn't express itself very clearly. It all happens at the level of unarticulated premises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Matonsela, for that. I'll hand over to Prof. Rosina Mart, and thereafter, Dr. Masondo will follow.
Thank you for organizing this very important panel discussion on the topic. I would like to look at three main points, and that is, we need to address the question of what is Black hair. If we're using the term Black, there's a whole history of that within the country. South Africa was colonized by the Dutch, by the English. We also have a history of the French Huguenots at the Cape. We also have a history of slavery at the Cape. I'm from that community. I was born and raised in District 6. My grandmother was part of that enslaved community. Her surname was September. And we know that the Dutch enslaved people and brought them from Java, particularly from Java and from other parts of Indonesia and also Malaysia. So if we're using the political term Black in the context of South Africa, that extends across the spectrum, right? So I want to say that first, because not many people, it seems from my last discussion, seem to understand the history of enslavement in the Cape, which means that we have a Cape Malay community, we have a colored community who identify as colored and Black, or colored and African. In my case, my grandfather was Xhosa from the Eastern Cape. So I want to be clear about what that spectrum means. There's also the spectrum of talking about African hair, which has happened in the last couple of days. There are 54 countries on the African continent. And within those 54 countries, we have Arab colonization. We know that African countries have been colonized by the Germans, the Belgians, the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese. So there's a broad spectrum of what hair could look like, right? So let me first talk about the whole question of tresemme, as the pronunciation suggests. The issue is not for me as to whether Clicks is promoting racism. The issue is that for decades, at least more than a century, beauty and cosmetic companies have been promoting this notion of what beauty is. And what beauty is, that beauty looks a particular kind of shape, size, comes with a particular kind of skin tone, comes with a particular type of hair. And so what the tresemme advert did, in my view, was actually rely on internalized insecurities of Black people in South Africa to, in some way, instill a sense of you've internalized this racism, and now we're drawing on your buying power to buy this product. I mean, this is not new. This has been happening for a very, very long time. In the article, I talked about the fact that, you know, in the 1700s, when the British colonized India, they did not know there was such a thing called shampoo. The word shampoo comes from India. So having said that, I want to just quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, talk about the whole question of corporations, right? What does that mean? What does it mean to have a corporation, and who manages these corporations? We have management, we have corporations, we have companies that have emerged in South Africa of late that are just following the traditional line. So if we're talking about decolonization within this context, how do we decolonize corporations and management companies? We have to ask ourselves one very important question, and that is, what is capital? What is capital? And the second question is, how does capital in any way have a relationship with the mind? And I'll answer that for you very quickly. Capital was accumulated in South Africa by using the labor power of the colonized, also known as the oppressed, which made up more than 89% of the population in the 1900s, but obviously much more in the 1600s. So capital was accumulated through the exploitation of the colonized, right? And so not only was capital accumulated in that way, but also the bodies of the colonized, right? That's us. Our bodies, our minds were also colonized, and obviously the internalized ways in which both racialized capitalism and apartheid worked brought us to an environment and in a setting that we've now inherited as Black people going into corporations, trying to start corporations. That is there. The mold is that, by and large, management is white, and those who need to be managed are Black people. Corporations have traditionally been, in South Africa, been white, and what has happened is that corporations have employed Black people, not only for labor, but as we've seen from the 1970s, for the way that we look, for the way that we appear. The Sarah Baartman story is not unusual. It's been used for time and time again. If we look at injections that are happening in the buttocks of the Hollywood stars, lip injections, breast augmentation, I mean, this is all a way to extract from the Black person what we have, and that is human capital, and that is intellectual property, what we own as Black people because of the material conditions under which we have lived, right? And which we continue to live. So from dancing to a range of cultural artifacts that belong to us, this has all been used by corporations around the globe. What I want to come to is, if we're going to talk about decolonization, right? We have to ask ourselves, do we want to live in a capitalist society? Who's going to be exploited? Who are we going to exploit in order to generate capital? Because all capitalism relies on the exploitation and oppression of the masses. And not only do we then take that labor, but we also take what the masses own. When you go to tourist companies around KZN, you will see 8, 9, 10 women from the KwaZulu region who make the tea, who clean the setting or the tourist environment, who make the lunch. And after your German or your Italian or your British tourists sit down, there will be the same people who are performing the Zulu dances. The same people, without, it's not a register that happens automatically. I have intellectual property. You know, my cultural artifact as my property, the way that I speak, the way that I look, the way that I dance is being commoditized. And this happens across the board. Then I want to make a very quick point here about the whole idea of why has it been so difficult to make flesh-colored plasters that addresses a broad range of skin tones, right? Now, in the article, I talked about the person who, 2019, had for the first time bought a plaster that was suitable to his dark skin tone. That got 96,000 immediate responses from Twitter, including one from John Boyega, who played Star Wars. If we look, I'm not religious. I want to make that very, very clear. My job as somebody who does psychoanalysis, political philosophy, and Black consciousness is to look at some of the threads. And we know that the Bible is a very important source for our colonizers and for the people who have enslaved us, right? When we read in the Bible about making the word flesh, the word flesh is very strategic in the history of religions. You can talk to me about Buddhism, you can talk to me about Islam, you can talk to me about Christianity. South Africa is, by and large, a Christian country, right? Whether it's Dutch law, the way that the notion of flesh has been utilized within South Africa, it's been afforded to white folks for a very particular reason. So when we say making the word flesh, we're saying making the word our truth, making the word speak to our existence as human beings. If we have not been regarded as human beings, how can we even think about our flesh as being testament to what is even acknowledged as human? This is not only the history of apartheid. We see this in the United States, we see this in Europe, we see this across the globe. I want to make a very quick point about unconscious bias. And this was raised by Prof. Madonsela. I'm on a very different viewpoint regarding this particular matter. I'm saying this now, not in the question and answer session, because I think, first of all, the unconscious speaks to ways in which the person has internalized and therefore hidden, forbidden, and repressed what they know. Unconscious isn't something that we speak readily. So when a person readily and easily says, "Is this your boss?" in my view, that is not unconscious bias. That is an assumption based on the way in which racism and sexism operates. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. March. A lot of that is coming through the Q&A, so I think you'll have adequate opportunity to speak back to those thoughts as well, and perhaps to clarify your contribution as well. Dr. Masondo, over to you.
Organizations and institutions, Marawai, Hukom, Kunganina, Huring. Do you know that Black identity matters? I blame it on history, organizations and institutions. Marawai, Hukom, Kunganina, Huring. Do you know my Black identity matters? The period of enlightenment taught everyone that an authentic identity is that of a white person Oh, Renee Descartes, your famous pronouncement that cognito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, poisoned the minds of people, organizations and institutions. Oh, organizations and institutions. Marawai, hukom kungani na goreng? Do you know my black identity matters? Oh, 1685 to 1815, you brought forth race as a benchmark for being human. The identity construction is based on Western science as the only epistemology. As a result, whites are accorded the status of being fully human, while other races are seen as barbaric, inferior, and superstitious. Colonialism, segregation, apartheid, even post-apartheid period, adopted such identity for humanities, that whites are superior because of Western science and other races are inferior. This permeated the worldview in this universe of what it means to be human, as if it is being white. Till today, organizations and institutions, ethos are based on cognito, ergo sum. Do you know my black identity matters? Blacks have red blood, whites have red blood. We breathe the same air. We are all human. Singabantu, Ribatu, we are mense. Difference is language, type of hair, but we are all human. Organizations and institutions, Marawai, Hukom, Kunganina, Horeng. Do you know my black identity matters? Do you know what renders a human being is a state of being? Is the ability also of being in communion with others. A human identity matters. A black identity matters. Umuntu agalashwa. You can't dispose a human being. Organizations and institutions. Marawai, hukom, kunganina, huring. Do you know my black identity matters? Singabantu, ribatu, onses mense, we are human. Let us unite. Greetings, everyone. Thanks, Miss Wendy. You spoke about advertisement, Prof. Tuli, the issue of unconscious biasness, very important. And Prof. Rosina, you also gave issues, you dealt with issues about, you know, basically being firm and knowing our history. With me, what I will focus on mainly, I see this topic that we are dealing with today about why does black identity remain in the margins of corporate companies. For me, it is a call for us as a nation, as the whole universe, to delve into a question of what does it mean to be human in the 21st century? And I'm not going to specifically talk about corporate. I will be holistic because people in the corporate are the same people that come from communities. So I will start with identity. The issue of identity is socially constructed, it's not static. We have multiple identities. It is dynamic and it is work in progress. Even today, as we speak, we impact on one another. And I believe at the end of this webinar, we will be transformed in one way or the other. So the issue of race also, it is not static. You know, the way we define race, it is dynamic, it keeps on changing. So for me, the issue of why the identity of black people are in the margins also lies on the issue of change. You know, I said, and when I was preparing, I started thinking about the concept of change, that we have to talk about the concept of change as we talk about this. The issue of change is very important. We must understand that it does not just happen, you know, like that. It takes time. Prof mentioned something very important that, you know, when the new South Africa came, we were so excited. We thought that, you know, change was just going to occur like that. That is not how change occurs, you know. So it is very important to understand that it is episodic rather than continuous. And we must expect relapses like what is happening now with the issue of cliques. You know, so I'm proposing a framework that I term National Spiral Teaching and Learning Framework, is NSTL framework. You know, I remember in the olden days, pre-colonial times, there was oral tradition, you know, teaching all the time. It is very important for us to teach. I'm going to cut my speech. The issue of race as a social construct, the origin, where does this originate? Pre-colonial history, among Africans, I'll draw mainly from the Zulus and the Basutos because I'm Musoto. Pre-colonial times, the identity, you know, what it means to be human was based on principles of Ubuntu. Issue of race, and basically what was happening that time was that the definition of Ubuntu was based on love, care, hospitality, respect, participation, you know, and that was very important. Yes, there was discrimination. I can't go into if maybe you don't have, but there was a mafisa, you know, assistance of the poor. So that type of, you know, helping one another. And there was a philosophy of trompo, ugushonipa, philosophy of umuntu agalahla, to assist people and, you know, to make it a point to fight against discrimination. So Europe, during the Enlightenment, it came with the issue of knowability. That in terms of the identity was based on the fact that you think, therefore you are human. And according to the period of Enlightenment, that person who could think was a white person. Hence we are in this webinar today, because everything that has to do with whiteness is now a conception about identity of a human being. So it is very important then that, you know, in this dispensation, the new South Africa, it is very important that as a nation, we must Buntulize the concept of identity. We have seen the concept of identity from a Western milieu that focuses on race, basically. Race that equals to whiteness has to be revisited. Ubuntu is there as an answer globally. We look at, yes, there are other aspects of identity, but there are many. But the key issue is the values that has to define a human being. So now, what can we do? What must we do as a way forward? I had to cut a lot. We need an epistemic rupture. We have to decolonize laws and policies. We must be bold for change. No matter what, it is important. We cannot, as Black people, even white people, we must fight against racism. Even white people, it is time to stand up for yourself. Being Black, it is so beautiful, it is important. Because as I said, it is about values, about lerado, about building others. It is not about undermining, because if you look at the conception of identity in terms of race, and I think, therefore I am, it is discriminatory, it is racist. So what we have to do is to make it a point that we have laws, even laws about hair, appreciation of Black hair. In America, there's a law based on that. So these laws, even issues that we think that they are just light, we must have laws about that. So another thing that is important, we have to participate, because the concept of Ubuntu says, I participate, therefore I am. It is very important to have agency. We must stand up and work. We must stand up and fight. And another important thing is decolonization of the Constitution. Our Constitution must be decolonized. We have to see ourselves in the Constitution. For me, it is frustrating that Ubuntu is just a cliche, but it is not there in the Constitution. Why not have it in black and white? Not only Ubuntu, because it is accepted by Westerners, but also the concept of Ugushonipa. You know, we look at Ugwaka. We look at umuntu agalashwa. Those are important values that have to be written even in our languages. So we need re-languaging in essence and embracing our blackness, embracing whiteness and working together. Maybe it's time even for whites to allow themselves to be, to encapsulate blackness within them as we have with whiteness. Thank you.
Can we move to Shanabs to give us her thoughts on Black identity in the corporate sector as well?
Thank you. Good day to all the attendees and to the esteemed guests. I'm honored to share this platform with you. I guess my response to this is from the field of semiotics, and I think it's important to kind of understand and make sense of this academically for me to respond. So when we look at semiotics, we look broadly at the study of signs and how they make meaning. As we know, a sign can be both linguistic in terms of its words, and it can be visual, and we're bombarded by visual signs and emojis in the world, and we communicate this way. In fact, I'm so intrigued by this communication form called emojis. In this advert, we have about 4 images, as been discussed before, with words used to describe these images. So we make sense of that. The images alone are polysemic. I think the audience could make their mind, whether positive or negative, about what those images mean and represent to them. But when it becomes problematic is when those images were anchored with meaning. So we gave them descriptive words and we attached meaning to it. And in the words of Roland Barthes, or borrowing from his term of anchorage, we anchored them in meaning so that the audience could see those terms or those images in no other way outside of the intended message the encoder had for those words. Second to that is the role of absent signifiers. So on one of the images with the woman with blonde straight hair, we attached the word normal. And that word, the absence of abnormal, is so powerful there because we see what is normal, and therefore anything outside of that paradigm of what we've described as normal is then by default abnormal. So when we look at these kinds of signs and how they make meaning, we can't argue that this wasn't racist. It is indeed a racist advert. The question yet again, which I'll pull from Prof. Madonseli, is whether that was intentional, whether it was conscious, or whether it was unconscious, and that's debatable. Furthermore, as my previous colleagues have mentioned, Afro-textured hair has always kind of been politicized. And I mean, it goes back to the slave trade and what Prof. Rosina was talking about, where our hair was used to measure privilege and access. I mean, I think of the transatlantic slave trade and the generation that came from as the product of rape, where they were judged for being lighter skinned and having softer hair, and then given privilege as a result of that. Likewise, during the apartheid system, where the pencil test was used to determine both race and privilege. So this kind of politicization of our hair is something that has caused internal trauma. It's caused Black people to have a complex and traumatic relationship with hair. I know, being from a colored community, that hair plays a very significant role in our identity and in determining privilege and beauty. In one family, you will have a sibling with straight hair, and in that same family, you will have a sibling with Afro-textured hair. And the trauma that is felt during those experiences and that I've witnessed it's widespread, it's far-reaching. And that brings me to what Stuart Hall was speaking about in terms of representation. And he said it takes on 2 forms: to represent as to mimic, and then obviously representation in terms of values, the set of values. And that's the problem within corporate South Africa. While we may have, different demographic being represented at different levels, the problem is, what are the core values that those corporations represent? I mean, I can give you an experience that I had, or share an experience I had at work. We had something called sensitivity training. And we called upon different people. We were from different race groups, ethnicities, genders, age groups. And we were talking about our experiences and how to create an inclusive space. However, at the end of that training, we had a male stand up and say, I'm white, male, and heterosexual, and I feel attacked. I didn't have a problem with what he said because I thought that was a breakthrough moment. I thought that was a moment that we could engage each other and really get through the issues that we experience in this corporate space we occupy. However, the chairperson of this meeting, of this training, shut down that meeting so fast that no one was given the opportunity to find a form of catharsis in this moment. And I think those are the issues that exist in space, beyond just having a diverse space. It's about what those institutions are representative of and how then they represent the society we live in. So just briefly, what I think can be done, I think obviously the obvious answer is about transforming corporate South Africa and the advertising industry. In fact, I did my own mock research and I saw that 5 of the biggest advertising global companies based in South Africa have 1 Black woman, co-governor, and 1 Black male. The rest are white males. So there is an obvious need for transformation, but it's I think it's far-reaching. We've got to get into the basic education system, change codes of conduct, change what we educate people about history, and then also access mainstream media. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think this advert definitely highlights some of the stark inequalities in South Africa and what's required for representation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Shannon. Quite a mouthful. You've given us quite a lot to think about. Before I go, colleagues, to a Q&A, I'd like to just make a short follow-up with 3 of you regarding what you just said now. And Prof. Matonsen, I'd like to start with you, because if we are to accept, Prof, that the Clicks ad, right, the Tresemme ad is an example of unconscious bias, what would, according to you, would be an appropriate response to institutional racism or this unconscious bias? How would an appropriate response look like to you?
Thank you, Say, and thank you to the colleagues for the wonderful presentations. Your response to unconscious, to action that is rooted in unconscious bias will depend on what are you trying to achieve. For example, if your idea is to shift the thinking of that person to recognize and embrace your humanity, so your strategy can't be the kind of strategy that confirms that person's bias, because people have to understand that as humanity, we have neural pathways that determine how we see the world and how we react to the world. And unconscious biases, neuroscientists tell us that there are codes inside our system that over all of the years of us being humans, they become part of our DNA. What they do is they help us to react to our environment, to decide, is this safe? Is this dangerous? Is this a friend? Is this a foe? So those pictures in our heads will tell us, this is right, this is good, this is safe. And racism has created these kinds of codes in our heads where Blackness is condemned, Blackness is seen as bad. And again, I invite people to read Verwoerd's book, because if that has then been codified in your head, you're not going to react by making people see you again as reflecting the very same things they fear about you. That's just my fear. If you're going to go into a shop, break things, ignore the law, and say that's how racism has to be confronted, I'm afraid you are actually entrenching racism. It's not going to go away. It's just going to go underground. I'm not saying there's no room for protest. I'm saying the first room, I would go with Dr. Masondo's approach. Engagement. Firstly, just to show people that racism hurts. Name calling hurts. And again, neuroscientists will prove that. People get hurt not only by being hit with a blunt force or with objects or being shot with a gun. just words that diminish your dignity hurt you, and your brain cannot distinguish between words and weapons. So we have to tell them that. But secondly, we need to educate, help people, all of us. I believe that we also have internalized racism. Some of the things that have been said to me in reaction to what I said about the Clicks advert, they just show to me internalized racism. The very fact that some Black people think that when we have a relationship with a white person, the white person is in charge. That's a colonized mind, because that colonized mind cannot imagine a relationship between a white person and a Black person as a relationship of equals, or even the possibility that the senior thinker in that relationship could be a Black person. That's a colonized mind. So we have to engage. And there's a lot of specialists. One of them is Nini Molefe, who came to talk to us for 4 consecutive weeks about unconscious bias, because that's what hurts most. That's what excludes people from jobs, excludes people from tenders, excludes people from clubs. It's these unarticulated premises that decide who qualifies, who doesn't qualify, what is good, what is not good, what is fashionable and what is not fashionable.
Thank you so much, Prof. Matonzela, for that. Before we go to Q&A, Prof. Mata, I wanted to ask you, because you wrote quite an interesting article for the Daily Maverick. I think you titled it Head Conditioning, Shampoo, and Colonization of the Mind. And you do this very interesting tracing of how the white colonial gaze and standards of beauty have been taken over the years, have been reinforced and institutionalized in others. And so I'm just interested in your ideas regarding what would be the alternative. How would we dismantle, I think Dr. Masando calls it the epistemic rupture, but what is the alternative? Should we be going for alternative Black capitalism, alternative Black conceptions of means of production? What would the alternative or even resistance possibly look like from you, Prof. Mart?
Hi, actually the title is The Mavericks, not mine. I had a much longer title. I think the point I was trying to make is that, first of all, I think that cosmetic and makeup companies, they rely on racism because they need to sell a product. You have to rely on something in order to sell a product. In the same way that we have seen for decades, you know, a model with a swimming suit sitting in front of a car, lying across the car. Does that make a Volvo or any other car for that matter more interesting? I'm not looking at Volvo. I don't want to mention any particular brand names. That's not the point. The point is, what do marketing and cosmetic companies use? They use what they know and understand as, you know, sexism, racism, classism, homophobia, because that is what is going to attract us. The ways that we have internalized racism. The way that I wrote the article, it comes from a book that I finished already called Black Consciousness and the Politics of the Flesh. And it basically looks at histories of how our bodies, from our hair to our physical appearance to all aspects of our identities, have been commoditized. And so for me, the question was not necessarily whether the advert was racist. Of course it was racist. You know, the way that it depicted Black women's hair speaks volumes. And so I think that the question of capitalism is a larger question, and I'm not sure whether we can address all of that here. What is important, though, is that I think that those questions about how do we generate capital, and what are the conditions under which we generate capital? Who are we going to exploit? If we've exploited Black people, you know, to make these adverts as in, this is not normal, this is not flesh, how are you going to buy into normal? Because it's exactly the same thing that companies have done decades ago in trying to suggest, you know, and I don't want to mention their names, if you buy this red t-shirt or this red mohair jacket or the blue one, color is just a commodity. You can buy all of the range of colors in these clothes and you can look cool and you can look hip. It has nothing to do with heritage. It has nothing to do with ancestry. It has nothing to do with the politics of identity. And so I think for me, the question is, how do we get companies to recognize that we cannot continue this trajectory of exploitation, because it speaks to 90% of our population. You exploit people's heritage and then you expect them to buy into another. And those are the fundamentals of capitalism. They need to generate capital. And if they're generating capital by expecting 90% of the population to buy into those securities that they have generated for centuries, it basically means we're buying into our own demise constantly.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for that. We'll now move to the Q&A, where we'll just be addressing the questions and the comments and some of the concerns that the attendees may have. So I think the first question is, what can we as a society do to bring light to corporates who constantly attack the identity of Black people through their advertisements? So what is the resistance? What is the alternative when these businesses profit on racializing, stereotypical and stereotyping Black people? What is our resistance? Shannon, let me go to you first. I was thinking in your Morning Live interview, you spoke about some of these things and the need perhaps to look more local, supporting local, and maybe that could be seen as a form of resistance. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just as you spoke about that, I was thinking about one of my responses. And really, I think for me, I'm against the destruction of property. What I feel that we as Black consumers need to do is we make up a large part of the purchasing body of South Africa. So as consumers, as Black consumers, we need to realize the agency we have and the purchasing power we have. So when companies like Clicks do things like this, corporates behave in this way, I believe that it is our role as the Black consumer to say, well, we're divesting in your brand. And I think that would hurt them even more than 1 week of looting, because here we are today, and the looting has stopped. Has the behavior stopped? We'll be sitting here, I guarantee you, in the next year or two and having the same discussion. So I think we as Black people need to find ways of exercising our agency. And I think using our purchasing power is one way.
Okay. Thank you for that, Shannon. Colleagues, feel free to unmute yourself and to just jump in if maybe there's a particular question that I've sent to another panelist that you'd like to jump at.
Yes, I think what we can, I also wrote a paper and about the Clicks issue, and it says transformation that went wrong. For me, what can be done is that it starts up there, because one, with the new South Africa coming in, the issue of transformation is key. But I got so disappointed that our government, since 1994, we don't have a ministry that deals with transformation. For me, that ministry was supposed to be seated in the presidency. Gender is very important, and that, for me, gender falls under transformation. You know, gender is important, but it is also part of transformation. Now we raise all the, so the Ministry of Transformation is supposed to be seated there. What I think also, all these ministries that we have must have transformation champions. Every company must have a transformation champion. Even in schools, wherever transformation, because transformation is key. Otherwise, we will forever experience this. You know, regress. And also, as I said, for me, this the national spiral teaching and learning. Oral tradition, as I said, pre-colonial. You know, there was teaching. You know, our grandmothers, you know, they used to sit under the tree and fathers teach about different things. It's very important, teaching. From, you know, for me, for example, political parties, I get so frustrated. When it's elections, you will see them running. They know how to call meetings. They know how to teach people about voting. But whenever there are issues, they will never go and teach. For example, this issue of racism now, we have councillors. Councillors are supposed to call meetings, workshops. We are here as academics. We can go and work with them. This is what I call the National Spiral Teaching and Learning Framework. Teaching and teaching. Churches are not only supposed to talk about spiritual issues. There must be workshops about issues that we see becoming a problem. Racism now, we must talk about that. And unfortunately or fortunately, no matter who can say what, we are talking about democracy. We have to live together, learn to work cooperatively together, black and white. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, colleagues. Prof. Matonsela, I'll be coming to you now because our Q&A is currently burning now because of you. And there's one question now that's asking your definition. What is your definition of racism that you subscribe to? And do you think Black people can be racist? Or maybe in your context, do you think Black people can have implicit biases? Maybe let's put it like that.
My definition of racism, it is an ideology that hierarchizes humanity on the basis of race. It is an ideology that places a premium on whiteness and a condemnation of blackness. So racism is, at the core of racism is the dehumanization of people on the basis of them being Black, and the exaltation of people on the basis of them being white. So there are people who are openly racist all over the world who do take a platform and say white people are smarter, white people deserve better, and things like that, and then Black people are all of the things that are bad. But they are a minority. So modern racism does not express itself like that directly. Modern racism is essentially mostly unarticulated assumptions. On the table, if you rejected, it would be an answer. I'll give you an example of racism that didn't inspire rage at the click of a Twitter button. Yet I think it was more racist than what happened at clicks. Somebody said that cricket, it's high time cricket went back to the fundamentals of excellence and left this race issue out. If we want cricket to be excellent, if we want excellence in cricket, kick the race issue out. I'm paraphrasing. When I read it, and I didn't want to respond because in the climate like this, you want to engage meaningfully with the person to say, that's racist, say, I know you don't intend it, but then you'd be gaslighting him, and then before he knows he's being insulted. And my intention was not to have him insulted, was to say, at the core of what you're saying is that if we don't consider race, it won't be considered. The truth is we're always considering race. Because of our unarticulated assumptions, we're always considering gender, we're always considering race, we're always considering age. We just don't articulate our assumptions. And therefore, when we appoint a person, or when we say a person is good, we don't say it's because of race, but the considerations we've made in our heads and didn't articulate had implications for race. So that's basically what I would say to this person. Can Black people have unconscious biases? Absolutely. The traditional standard of racism is that it's a person is racist when they say that one nation, one racial group is superior to the other. And therefore, in the olden days, we used to say Black people can't be racist because there's no Black person who believes that they are superior to a white person. I think the modern world is far complex than that. And South Africa is even more complex. The race issue in South Africa is not the same thing as the race issue in America, where Blacks are a minority. Here, Blacks can at least leverage their numbers as capital and play it out in politics. Of course, socially, they're still disadvantaged because of the shadow of the past, and economically. So you can't say that we're in the same space as Black people in America. That's why I worry about how then we fight back, because we have the potential of working the way they did it in Rwanda. And the way, remember in Rwanda, the underprivileged group was a majority. And then suddenly they were gaslighted into calling the Tutsis cockroaches. And before we knew what was happening, the Hutus were attacking the Tutsis. Germany, the same thing with Hitler.
Sorry, Prof. But just to give you a chance to clarify, you are not saying, you are not devaluing or underemphasizing what Clicks and the Tresemme ad was doing by saying it's implicit biases or it's unconscious biases. You are simply saying there's different kinds of racisms up there. Are we getting you clearly?
Absolutely. So in fact, in everything that I've written, I have said unconscious bias is a form of racism, sexism, because it applies whether we're talking xenophobia. There are people who won't openly say, I hate foreigners, I think foreigners are negative in this way, but there's implicit bias, the way I would behave, etc. Yeah, so I'm not saying it wasn't racist. I was saying it was a different kind of racism that can be addressed through Shannon's kind of engagement and through Dr. Masondo's approach to engagement. Just lastly, though, to say that one is not ruling out protest as a final story. It's just that protest, like firing a gun, is not the first thing you do. Excellence is the best antidote to racism. FUBU was born because one of the brands in America attacked black buttocks, not hair this time. So, now, we don't want them to wear our pants anyway because they look ugly on black buttocks. And FUBU was born to cater for the kinds of figures that Black people have. For us, by the way, those
Absolutely.
who don't know what FUBU means.
Thank you for that, Prof. Matozola. Prof. Rosina Matt, can I come to you? Because I stopped you when you were trying to provide sort of like a conceptual clarity regarding what you see as implicit and conscious bias and what I think you're articulating to be structural racism.
First of all, I'm going to say that Biko's definition of racism is still very current today, and it's still very relevant. I do not consider racism an ideology. White supremacy is the ideology. I'm also old enough to know that I'm not going to put myself in a position to be one Black person going against another Black woman on this panel, okay? So what I'm saying has got nothing to do with, I'm not here to dispute what Prof. Thuli was saying. I'm here to offer my position. Racism is an act. It is an event. It relies on the system of white domination. Now, the system of white domination that we've had in place comes from a history of settler colonialism in this country, right? Now, we can say, but we don't have the formal structures of apartheid anymore. But we know that historically, 342 years later, if we count 1652, as the moment of uninvited usurpation of the land to set up a colony, right? And of course, what we know through the history of the country is that there's structural, there's systemic, and there's institutionalized racism. I absolutely will stand by Biko's definition and Biko's understanding of what happens in a white-dominated society. The people who benefited from apartheid have not left. They are still the same people who come to decolonization symposiums and conferences. They're still the same people that are our colleagues. And I usually ask them, what are you decolonizing from? So I'm not the kind of person to take a backseat and not ask important questions. The important questions is, racism is alive and well. It hasn't gone away. Just because we're in a post-94 situation where every single person has a vote, where we have equality before the law, does not mean that the historical racism, let's face it, folks, is still here. And it is still what is being used on a day-to-day basis in all aspects of our society. Black people would have to have the structural, the institutionalized, the individualized, and the systemic forms of domination in order to be racist. Let's go back to Biko people. Let's go and read Anton Lembedi. Let's go and understand why Robert Sobukwe walked out of the Freedom Charter meeting, because he did not want to be in a position where our colonizers become included in our way that we envision freedom and democracy. We cannot let history walk away, we cannot allow these notions to put us in positions where we let history walk away. History is alive and well. We have to tackle these issues.
Absolutely agree. Thank you for that, Prof. Matt. Perhaps let me also clarify that the way the nature of that question was set up was not to set up one Black woman versus another Black woman, but was to promote the diversity of thought, the epistemic diversity and the contestation of ideas that I strongly believe underpins the academic project. So it's not to say Ali versus Ali and therefore we need to dismantle each other, but it's to create a safe and conducive environment for the plurality and diversity of thought. I think it's important that this webinar is properly understood and the questions that are being organized. Let's go back to the Q&A. Oh, you want to jump in, Prof. Madonsa?
Yeah, I just want 2 minutes and say I like the way you phrased the question, because for me, it's giving me a sense of what people are hearing me saying. And that's something I'm famous for having said as a perpetrator, that it doesn't matter what you're saying, what matters is how are you being heard. Just what I'm hearing here is people understand me to be saying there's no racism anymore, or some people understand me to be saying unconscious bias is not racism, it's not structural racism, it's not systemic racism. Yet the articles that I've written say exactly that. And they're not starting now. They start from when I'm 18, when I'm engaging, for example, with Dr. Bani Pichana, who accuses my boss, Dennis Davis, and say you are racist. And my boss, I'm still at CALS and I'm young, I'm about your age. And my boss is hurt because he's a good person. If you know him, he's a judge now, he's a good person. And he comes to us and I say to him, you are racist, Bani Pichana is right. It would be impossible for you not to be racist in a society that is anchored in racism. And then I explained to him exactly what I'm talking about unconscious racism. Okay. That is part of our psyche. But today he now agrees with me. Then he didn't understand, because people tend to think racist people are bad people, whereas racists are people who have internalized racism. Where I might differ with my colleague is that I do think that Black people have internalized racism, and how they engage with each other. Often they use the very same racist tools to judge other Black people and judge everyone. And then secondly, I do also believe that Black people can be biased against white people, and Black people in South Africa have far more power than Black people in America. It might not be anchored in the economic structure of society and the social structure, but in South Africa, trust me, Black people do have power in the same way that Germans had more power than Jews in Nazi Germany, and the same thing that happened in Rwanda between the Tutsis and the Hutus. Numbers do count.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Prof. Matonsela. Going back to the Q&A, there's a question there asking, how can we better articulate our frustrations to corporates in real time who sometimes respond with inappropriate comments that we are angry and difficult? So I think it's one of those tensions where you see some of these challenges at work, but you're employed, you need to feed your family, you have all these other things that you need to balance. So you can't just give them your thoughts, but you also have to, I don't know, do it strategically in ways that also safeguards yourself and your source of income. We know about Black tax, we know about your dependents, we know about the Black lived experience and anything like that. So I don't know if that can go to you, Shannon and Dr. Masondo as well, around how can you navigate some of those challenges where you see something wrong, you want to articulate it, at the same time they employ you, they pay you, and you need to toe sort of like a fine line.
Geez, that's you left the difficult one for me to answer. I mean, you know, I just have to speak of my own experience. I'm 27 and I'm just about starting my career. And I think I found myself in this position so many times this year alone. You at times work for companies or in spaces where you don't necessarily agree with the underlying values of the entire system, yet you feel powerless. I guess I'm lucky in a sense because I always kind of stand firm in my qualifications, and I come from a really stable background. But I mean, I've had that instance this year alone where I've had to challenge a dean, or I've had to challenge a superior. Yet again, it has to be done strategically. How we measure this, how strategic, how we can measure it. I've seen people, you know, I don't want to give away my context, but I mean, I've seen people in positions being pushed out because they were a certain race, even if the dominant race group in that space were just as implicated in it. So I really don't know the way to answer, because when you feel like you're in a position and you don't have that economic power in a space that is culturally dominated by certain people, it's almost difficult. But these are conversations that we need to have as a broader Black society, and how we hold these corporates to power and to how we hold them accountable for their actions. These are conversations we need to have, and I'm hoping that my colleagues who maybe are a little bit more experienced than me can give advice to someone as young as me who feels like I'm in that position.
No, I think you've done justice to it. Dr. Masondo, you want to jump in?
Yeah, as a person who uses a indigenous knowledge lens and decoloniality, I'll draw from the Basotho and Zulu. They say when we do things, we have to build. Masakane, ari achane. Hence the issue of violence. Honestly speaking, we cannot say we are building by being violent. Passive resistance is very important. We can engage differently with passive resistance. Everything that we do as a nation is to achana. Also, as the question has, you have stated the question correctly, in the workplace, it starts by knowing who you are, the power of purpose. You were born to make it a point that there's change. Love yourself enough to make it a point that whenever there is something you don't agree about, you talk about it. Strategically, using ho'achana, uguakana, not being destructive. And another important thing is that what I've realized with humanity, we are reactionary. We are not proactive, and especially as leaders in the corporate, we know that these issues of, crisis and it occurs. It's very important that we have workshops on such issues, modus operandi in the workplace about how we can work about different issues, Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Mason. I think a lot of the questions that are coming up, colleagues, I think there's a tension between, yes, they understand the challenges that are happening, but what is the way forward? What is the way forward? And one of the questions that are being posed, colleagues, and perhaps Prof. Mart can jump in as well, is what would resistance look like? Do we start with trying to impose these diversity training posts? I know they were hugely unsuccessful in the UK, and they are under intensive criticism in terms of starting with children and making them compulsory at higher education institutions. Does it start with local community organizations? What would the alternative, or trying to, it doesn't have to be macro systemic structural, but where would we start to begin to shed awareness about these kinds of racism that are happening? Prof. Mart?
I think it's quite unfortunate that we have 90% of the population being Black in the country, and we have to almost bend down and genuflect to a white population. I think in any given situation, if you look at the whole question of, of South Africa's history, surely the white population has to come on board and understand you are on the African continent, you are in South Africa, you are a settler, you have to recognize who a South African is and what does it mean to be a South African. It means you have to recognize the culture of indigenous people. You also have to recognize the culture and the history of people who come from those histories of enslavement. So for me, as I've said before, for me, transformation has to be reread, not in a way that says, how do we appease people, but how do white folks transform and get rid of or denounce their beneficiary status and their status as agents of a system of white domination. There are also larger questions, and those questions are about Black people having companies, corporations, cosmetic companies, and not just thinking about this as a question of having to either transform or to resist buying these items. It is also about creativity. It's about setting up the parameters for what we consider worthy items to purchase, and with the image that we consider worthy to adhere to. So those are questions that I think we need to have as part of the discussion broadly, because otherwise we're just allowing ourselves to be streamlined to, again, establishing this paradigm and perpetuating this notion that we are passive consumers, that we are not creators, that we are not initiators, that we do not start businesses, but we rather try to topple them. And I think the question of creating cosmetic companies, creating corporations, creating different standards of how we organize management, those are important for us in terms of the way forward.
Thank you for that, Prof. March. There's a comment there specifically for Shannon, and I think it's slightly a little bit provocative, but I think Shannon is strong enough. She can push back. I think it's around the woke generation and how easily offended the woke generation technically usually is. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Shannon, and whether that's a limitation or no, you strongly believe that social media can be a tool to hold power accountable, essentially.
I think it definitely is a tool. This whole outrage was basically sparked on social media, and then it hit mainstream media. So I think social media has been one of the key tools to holding people to power. At the same time, I think social media has also been quite destructive because of the algorithms and because of what it allows in terms of the spread of fake news. But I mean, if we look at it in terms of what it's done in moments like this, in moments like Black Lives Matter, in moments where celebrities have decided now to kind of go off social media for a cause, to hold these platforms accountable. I think it plays a huge role, and it will continue to play a huge role in society. And I think for many protests to come, this platform is important. And I think it's often, as I said at the beginning of at the beginning of this, it's often the point, the source. My students were sending me WhatsApp messages about the clicks debacle before it hit the news. And it shows the gravitas of this platform for engagement.
Absolutely. Prof. Matonsela, I'm asking you provocatively about social media as a tool for social accountability and perhaps pushing back. What is your sense on that?
I think social media is one of the greatest inventions of our time. It has democratized communities. It has brought us back to being a village of some sort because we can talk, something that we couldn't. And we don't have to have our thoughts mediated by the mainstream media. But as Shannon has said, it also has the booby traps of fake news and the fact that also when people are frustrated, they lash out on social media. And some people don't really have the elephant skins that some of us who have been in the bush, in the trade union movement, in the civic movement have. So there are people who don't have my thick skin, and I worry about bullying in social media. And that's why sometimes I push back on behalf of other people, because it can really cause a lot of mental health. I just want to say one thing about the generation that you said takes offense easily. There are studies that have been done on millennials and now Generation Z, that you guys are a generation that doesn't just take offense easily. The generation is more egalitarian. So whereas my generation would have tolerated certain forms of hierarchy, certain forms of dehumanization, this young generation does not tolerate social injustice. And therefore, I'm not really concerned about young people pushing back against injustice. And the studies also show that they push back against injustice, not just against themselves. They also have the compassion to push back against injustice for other people. Hence, if you remember before fees must fall, young people were pushing back for employees of universities who were outsourced. They couldn't understand being told that outsourced workers can't talk to you as a student. I mean, these are their fathers, these are their mothers, these are their uncles. And when they had interviews with these people, they found that these people are not even allowed to have their children study for free. Only people who are tenured like us get that. I think we can harness that social justice orientation of young people. Where I differ with them is the need to quickly fight. You know what ngesiZulu sithi lokuphuma silwe. I think fighting should not be the first thing you do. When there's an opportunity to change society without fighting, you can do that. It's one of the rules in The Art of War by Lao Tzu or Sun Tzu. Don't fire, the best general is one who wins a war without firing a gun. But Shaka Zulu, the best general this continent ever created, overproduced, was Shaka Zulu. He never fired a shot, or he never attacked the community without the need to. The first choice he gave to a community was to voluntarily surrender. Only if there was no voluntary surrender would he fight. Genghis Khan also did the same thing. So my message to young people would be, if we can engage, if we can change people, we have to change people. But secondly, my message to corporate South Africa is don't wait until people are angry and they're kicking things down before you listen to them. We need leaders that are courageous, to step out of their comfort zone, because embracing diversity, embracing the humanity of people who don't look like you requires you to step out of your comfort zone. Because when you're sitting in the boardroom with people like you, they laugh at your jokes because they come from the same cultural content. You have to step out and be willing to be with people who are not going to laugh at your jokes until eventually you create this new group. You need people who are compassionate, who are prepared. Leaders in corporate South Africa who are prepared to see life from the point of view of the young people who are entering corporate South Africa. There's a young person who's written a book that says corporate South Africa hates young Black women. That's her experience. I don't think corporate South Africa hates young Black women, but that's how, I think it's Sihle Polani. That was her experience. So we need to listen to people like Sihle Polani and find out what is it that you're doing, whether you intended it or you didn't intend it, what were you doing that made this young person conclude that? And thirdly, we need commitment. People who are truly committed to the social justice vision of our constitution, which is about really growing together and becoming a prosperous and peaceful South Africa.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. Dr. Masondo, there's a specific question for you regarding the role that history curriculum, and just in general, higher education can play in recentering indigenous knowledge system, indigeneity, and others, so that it can normalize it. What role can the academy play in making sure that indigenous knowledge systems, including hair and others, are prioritized and foregrounded in curriculum?
What we can do basically is making it a point that we integrate indigenous knowledge in our curriculum. Many people, when they talk about indigenous knowledge, they think that we only talk about African indigenous knowledge. This is a universal concept. Indians have their own indigenous knowledge. So indigenous knowledge is very important. So we have to integrate it there. And what will assist is when we put it as a policy, mandatory policy. Now it is a choice. It shouldn't be a choice. It must be a must. The cluster that I'm leading, I started by saying, let us transform the curriculum by integrating indigenous knowledge. How? I said 5% quantum, you know? So that quantum, we integrated that way. So it's very important. So the government, in terms of curriculum, it has to be enforced. It is a must. Because if we don't, we are still adhering to whiteness as a signifier of what it means to be human. We are all human. African indigenous knowledge has science in it. It is scientific. So it is very important that we, hence I say, is change. We need boldness. When I started teaching in 1995, that is what I taught my students from as early as 1995 about indigenous knowledge. Because a historian, especially a Black historian, who does not use a decolonial theory, there's a problem there. Because it is us who have to push and enforce. You know, when a baby has to come out of the mother, the baby does not just come easily. We have to force. It requires force from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. Dr. Masondo. Prof. Mart, I'm going back to you because there's a provocative question here from Mohammed Musa, who's wondering, I think this is just a thought, that perhaps these these apartheid categories and classifications of black, white, Indian, colored, is that not perhaps at the heart of what's creating and perpetuating this inequality? Or perhaps is it time to move beyond these categories? So he's wondering, to what extent can we do away with them? And maybe that would start the grassroots work of mending those race relations.
Well, patriarchy is still fully entrenched, alive and well, and so is white supremacy. So unless we dismantle, those ideologies, and we dismantle a system of white domination, we're not going to easily rid ourselves from those identities. They are not just labels. I saw some of the comments refer to it as labels. These are identities that were placed on people, during the classification period, which some of us inherited from our parents and our grandparents. But it also has been identities that we've had to inject with in terms of our own understanding of what does it mean to be black, or what does it mean to be colored, or what does it mean to have one identity that speaks to both those histories. And I think we do have a generation who asks those kinds of questions. And the difficulty with that is not that we can't have those identities. The question should be, it's about systems of domination and oppression that are still in place, that uses the histories of those identities to still reproduce themselves and to maintain systems of domination throughout. So that's my position. I'm not going to stop calling myself a woman just because I think I shouldn't be calling myself a woman, or I'm not going to stop calling myself a black woman or acknowledge my colored history and identity. I think that is still, for me, we haven't come to that day that we can say, or that I can say that I can stop doing that. I think when in the United States, Barack Obama was voted in as the first black president, that discussion was also around. Does that mean now racism has ended? We have a black president. We didn't think this was going to happen in the United States. No, I don't think so. I think people can choose to identify as they wish. We cannot stop people from identifying however they want to. I mean, for example, I've seen people call out now the term woman of color, and I correct people and I say, I'm not a woman of color. Woman of color is used in the United States and Canada as an umbrella term post-1987, when it was much more productive for people from different racialized communities to come together under an umbrella body and say, how are we going to fight the system of white domination? So those kinds of identities are still very strongly linked to the way that we do our work as, for example, Black consciousness thinkers, as scholars, and also to tackle that history that I don't think has sufficiently been done. I mean, I think we still need to do a lot of work on recovering what was hidden and forbidden in terms of our histories in the country.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. Marge. So I'd like to give my panel members maybe 30 seconds or slightly less to just give us their closing ideas or closing thoughts on this particular topic and the way forward. Prof. Matonsela, let me start with you, 30 seconds or less. Any closing thoughts on this topic or what's popping through your mind?
Thank you, KwaZulu-Natal University, for the privilege. To end racism, we have to end the hierarchization of difference. If we focus on racism alone, it becomes just us, and it's a losing war because there will always be somebody that we find to push to the bottom of society. What we do need is an approach of social justice that embraces the humanity of every person, not just in terms of dignity about what we say about each other's hair, but dignity in terms of acknowledging the humanity in all aspects, including involving everyone in the economy. And in this regard, please join us in the Social Justice M Plan, which is really about reversing the continuities of the past and ending structural inequality as soon as possible, but in particular, ending poverty by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Masonto, your closing thoughts?
I also want to thank the corporate relations for inviting me. For me, I think I have mentioned a lot of way forwards, but what I will tease out is one, to end racism is very important that we endorse, move away from looking at the, construction of identity from a wide perspective, that it is about science, how you think. We have to Ubuntuize identity construction, what it means to be human. We must Ubuntuize that. Because if you look at the values that are entrenched in Ubuntu, that will assist us to deal with racism. Because Ubuntu is about care. When you love someone, you will never be racist. It is about respect. When you respect someone, you will never be racist. It is about hospitality. When you are hospitable, there will never be racism. Participation. Through participation is exactly the framework that I propose, the National Spiral Teaching and Learning Framework. We work together, we teach continuously. In our different spaces, the counselors in wards, they must be able to start organizing the workshops where they talk about every and any critical issue that they see might affect our country. So we need that. Ubuntuization of the corporate system, Ubuntuization of industries, Ubuntuization of even our universities. We need to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masondo. Prof. Mart, let me go to you for your closing thoughts.
I think the time is now. We have to address what do we do in terms of cosmetic companies, in terms of taking care of our humanity. The issue is not about how do we have a humanistic approach. We are the ones that have been human. We are the ones that have remained human. Usurpation and settler coloniality, that was an act of cruelty. That was an act of dehumanization. We don't have to prove as Black people that we can be human, that we can treat white people as human. We know that we are human. We know that all of the ways in which settler coloniality and apartheid happened was about dehumanization, right? So we know it's not about the fact that we don't treat other people as human. The question is, as scholars and as intellectuals, as teachers, this is not a popularity contest. This is not about what makes us popular. This is about doing the hard work, doing the historical work and speaking out against injustices. But it is also about encouraging our young students and the young population of South Africa, the entrepreneurs, the ones who want to create companies with a vision for the future that is based on how we look, what is our multi-layered appearances, what kind of aesthetic do we want to produce, rather than continuing to address the aesthetic that is racist and offensive. I think there's a part of us that always has to challenge and question, but there's also a part of us that has to create. And I'm interested in the creating part just as much as I'm interested in the critique. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mart, for that. Shannon, your closing thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think I agree with my esteemed panelists, but I think it's important for us to take note that identity and representation are both complex and mobile concepts, so they're always subject to change. And I think we need to engage with it more actively. I think we need to actively engage with learning, unlearning, and changing our paradigms of thinking. And that will help us in terms of internalized racism and unconscious bias that we adopt over time. I think we also need to reconsider value-based systems like capitalism and the role they play in marginalization and exploitation of people. And just to Prof. Mart's point, I mean, I lecture first year filmmakers and future television practitioners. And one of the key things I do is I instill in them the value of representation. And I think it's important as educators to really get our students, no matter what field we are in, to understand the importance of representing identities in society. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you for that, Shannon. I think on that excellent point, Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this session. I will now be handing over to the Acting Executive Director for Corporate Relations, Ms. Noma Zondo, who will be doing the closing for us. Over to you, Noma.
Thank you, facilitator. Our most valued invited guest, thank you very much. It was such an honor to host all of you this afternoon. And I would like to extend our gratitude to the audience and to the members of the media who were with us today. Of course, a special thank you to all the speakers for gracing us with their presence this afternoon and for sharing with us your experiences and also your opinions. Thanks again for such a robust discussion. We have a lot to think about. We've got, we've realized that this discussion, we can take days and days discussing this topic because it's actually, we're still dealing with a lot of issues, deep-rooted issues in our society of racism and inequality. So it's very important to engage and stay engaged because there's a lot that we can deal with when we talk to each other. I must also mention our deep sense of appreciation to our facilitator, who is been more than gracious with the time. Dr. Hlatshwayo, thank you for doing such a stellar job. I thank you very much. Lastly, to the UKZN team for taking care of the logistics and making sure that this webinar is a success. As our facilitator said, it's really a start of a conversation. We still have a long way to go to actually deal with these issues. And Professor Masondo, thank you for treating us to that poetry. It was unexpected, but we really loved that. So I'd like to thank everyone, as I said, Professor Matontela, Professor Matt, and Professor Masondo again, and Miss Nola left earlier. We'll thank you again. So again, thank you so much, Landis. All the best, and please stay safe.